Okay, hi. So I am here with Professor Dana Renga of the Ohio State University in, has to be the Ohio State University in the United States. And I'm just going to briefly introduce Dana, and then we're going to have a conversation about mafia movies, masculinity, and anything else that comes to mind. And just as you can see here, I've put up three of her books that are most relevant to our conversation. And Mafia Movies, a Reader, I think the first edition came out in 2011, is that right?
So, yeah.
Yeah, but it came into a second edition last year, the year before?
2018.
2018. So expanded, lots of new material, and kind of one of the first big books that looks at both Italian and Italian American, or more broadly American, kind of representations of mafia, organized crime, etc. With, I don't know, dozens of contributors. I don't know how many it is.
53.
Oh my God, right. So it's if there's a film about the mafia, there will be a chapter, probably. And then Unfinished Business, which is a book about the mafia and as a kind of Italian national trauma. We're going to come back to that, I think, a little bit, but really reading some important Italian mafia films through the lens of gender. And that leads on then to the most recent book, which is really about masculinity and mafia, well, organized crime, criminal narratives on Italian TV in recent years. So the subtitle is Gomorrah and Beyond, but Gomorrah, the series, was the kind of basis for that kind of thinking about our attachment to sympathetic perpetrators. And yes, so Dana is professor of Italian with a specialism in film and media at the Ohio State University. And she's obviously an expert on all of these topics. And I, as I said to you, I'm teaching several films this term on different courses that you are very familiar with. The Godfather, of course, Goodfellas, Gomorrah, the film, not the series, and Sorrentino's The Consequences of Love. So hopefully our conversation can range through, all of these films. And so I'm going to stop sharing that so that we can see you better, and I'll make myself smaller. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to start with my first question, which is about masculinity, strangely enough, which is both your and my preoccupation, right, on screen representations. So you argue in Sympathetic Perpetrators that although we now see a glamorization of mafia characters on Italian TV, which is a kind of relatively new phenomenon, that there is still often a general presentation of masculinity in crisis in different ways. So I wondered if you could just say something more about how this supposed crisis of masculinity might be present in films as diverse as, say, The Godfather or Gomorrah or The Consequences of Love, even.
That's a great question. First of all, thank you, Catherine, for inviting me. And hello to all you students out there. It's great to kind of connect virtually in such a weird time. And I
think it is one of the good things about this pandemic, isn't it? Is that it has brought people sort of into the classroom a bit more, though that's something I know you've always done a lot.
No, and I think you have too. It's just nice. And I think we need to do it more. I'm going to ask you to do something for my mafia class.
Okay. Is it about masculinity by any chance?
Quid pro quo, a little mazzetta. But no, I was thinking about asking you to talk about teaching, like kind of teaching mainly The Godfather from the perspective of masculinity. So watch out for that.
Okay.
But no, that's a great question. And I think there's like probably the most alignment with the TV serials and things I watched with what's happening in The Consequences of Love, for sure, which is, I know, a obsession of yours that I've latched something to, is male melodrama. And and so I think most of the TV serials I discuss in the book, especially the Sky and the Netflix ones, can all be like really productively classified under the genre of male melodrama. And Consequences of Love is a perfect male melodrama. It works so well. First of all, you can't have Tony Servillo without having a male melodrama. So that box
is always melancholy.
He's always melancholy. And in the kind of the whole film is, I think, this kind of constant attempt to consolidate his crisis masculinity, and then celebrate the crisis masculinity at the end of the film at his death. So his death, unlike when I would have brought Unfinished Business, but it's my office and I'd have to brave the mask wearers to get there. I'm working at home right now. But what I found in that book that we can talk about more later is that films that focus on women in the mafia, their narratives kind of they're never wrapped up. They're never they never find a good home. They're never, they're always left kind of adrift. I just taught Angela yesterday.
Such a good film.
Used your chapter from Mafia movie.
Yeah.
Students love it. I asked them a question. According to Catherine O'Rourke, Angela, can it be considered a woman's film? Why or why not?
The answer?
Well, about half of them, those who have read your chapter, say no, it can't, because of the hyper-masculine context of the mafia, of the gangster picture. So
there you go. That's the answer.
Those who have not read the chapter and done the reading say yes, because it's just like a woman, and it's a woman, it's a film.
It's a woman, she's in a film. Yeah.
So films like Angela or Galantuomini, Windspear film, those are very few examples focusing on women, and their narratives have no resolution. They don't have solidarity, but they don't find kind of, a loving family or anything. And, but with Consequences of Love is perfect with crisis masculinity. In the end, he's, murdered by being slowly lowered in a vat of concrete, an old mafia trick for getting rid of a body. And his life is celebrated. Everything's kind of celebrated. His relationship with Sophia is celebrated. The gift to the aging couple is celebrated. His memories, his best friend who works on the power line, whose name I forgot. He has that really interesting name.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So it's all about like love, family, and generosity when he dies. So I think that the crisis in The Consequences of Love is a guiding narrative of the whole film that kind of is, this masculinity in crisis is celebrated and not kind of denigrated with women in crisis. I taught The Godfather a few weeks ago. I've heard Catherine's teaching The Godfather, and
I'm teaching it a lot this term.
It's super
giving.
And I've started to teach it more frequently in recent years from the perspective of gender. I found that at least when I first started teaching this Mafia movies class, I had a more, I would say, traditional student draw, which were mainly male first and second year undergrads who were Mafia aficionados and loved it, didn't like The Godfather to be blemished. So
they did not like to critique it.
No. And so I found it there was more pushback to thinking about gender, race, these kind of really problematic kind of The Godfather definitely takes up. And as the demographics of our student body have changed, I see so many more women and people of color, first generation students, international students in the class. Students are much more interested in talking about the problematic aspects of The Godfather. And so we talk a lot about the crisis masculinity in there. And this is like a basic 2000 level general education class, and students are coming, they're mainly business and engineering, public health majors.
They're not film studies majors or anything like that.
No, they don't have, it's every so often we'll get a few film studies majors or a few humanities majors, but for the most part, they've never taken like a gender theory class. They've never, and so we really start at this question of masculinity is a construct. And we talk through that. And a lot of people are like, no, it's not. And then, but looking at so many of the, I always show them that scene with Johnny Fontaine. What should I do? You can act like a man. And then he slaps him and he says, you want to be a Hollywood, fennel bulb? I would tell him my love for fennel, but not for that terminology in Italian. And we use that as kind of a starting point for the conversation about masculinity as a construct, and that masculinity is constantly in crisis and needs to be reconsolidated and revalued throughout the film. And then I assigned some readings from Renata Siebert on what it means to like be a man in the mafia, and it's all about performativity, and it's constant performativity. And so that ends up getting to be quite exciting when we talk about crisis masculinity in The Godfather, and look at how masculinity is performed amongst the three sons and who I call creepy Tom Hagen.
Poor Tom.
Poor Tom. My students are like, why is he creepy? And I said, we'll know when we do The Godfather Part 2. But
yeah, gosh, yeah. Well, he's the outsider, right? You know,
he's the outsider. He's connected with the most bloody stuff.
Interesting.
Spoilers for Part 2, but there's a lot of. So we look at how like Sonny, Fredo, Michael, and Tom's masculinity is kind of enacted in the film, and what it says about their ability to be the Godfather, and like what slips them up and what doesn't, you know, what's their downfall and what's not. Like, why is Michael the chosen son? You know, Sonny, it's all about he's impatient and he acts on rage and he's unpredictable, right? And those are, according to the mafia and according to Don Corleone, those are moments you have to repress to be man. And you know, and like when he talks to Michael about the famous pull the string episode, and he's like, women and children can be careless, men can't afford to be careless. How's your boy? You know, my students are always shocked to find that Michael actually has a daughter as well.
Oh yeah, which we never really,
it's always about the presents to the boy. The like in Godfather Part 2, it's always like, Tom, get him a present, you know, what about the daughter? And so, you know, and things like what never talk business outside of the family. There's these like, and they're very structured about what it means to be in the mafia, which maps on really well to Renata Siebert's research on speaking to hundreds of mafiosi, either in prison or who were pentiti, and what they say it meant to be a man. Or also the essay here by the Schneiders. That super sweet, wonderful academic couple, but they're very nice. When Peter Schneider went to go, like, for some reason, all these mafiosi like invited him into these backwoods gatherings, and he'd spend weekends with them out in the middle of nowhere, where they'd cross-dress and they'd denigrate women while wearing women's clothing and makeup.
Oh my God, it's so complex.
So, and then I guess in Gomorrah, I just published something for Christian Uva, who did a thing on Garone. It was one of those Italian frames things, and I did it on. It was kind of based on what I wrote in Unfinished Business, but I talked about. I added a whole thing of the coming of age film, the coming of age genre with Toto, who comes of age in Gomorrah, and what it kind of means to come of age, which is to again consolidate one's masculinity, ritualistic, performative, you know, all the mirror stage stuff.
And to betray the mother, right? Because that's what you talk about in your essay in Unfinished Business, right? Because that's kind of almost the most tragic part of that film, isn't it?
Yes, it's the most. I mean, that's another thing I always ask my students. I do a poll. How many of you thought he was going to warn them?
Oh no.
So I think it plays out in very different ways, and it's interesting that Consequences of Love being Italian, I think because of like a lot of the crossovers maybe in production and things like that, is much similar to the Italian serials, much more explicit, I guess.
Yeah, but I think you're right, and as you say that this, you know, this idea of masculinity in crisis, which is always kind of just another way of recentering it and kind of making it productive, and endlessly talking about it, you know, is something that kind of, you know, the film texts themselves kind of offer, isn't it? You know, which is why they're so perfect for these kinds of readings.
Yes, exactly. And we get more. How do I put this? At least in my neck of the woods, I'm really interested to see that my more traditional students are much more open to having these conversations than they were like 8 years ago.
Well, that's good. So what, having the conversations about gender and about masculinity,
taking the films to task rather than just holding them up as
Yeah,
Oh, the
the
gold standard.
myth, you know, yeah, iconic, they're so cool, yeah. And yeah, well, that kind of brings me to my second question, which is about this myth of the mafia,
Mhm.
which you cover in several of your publications, right? And obviously, we know The Godfather is an iconic movie in so many ways, right? And how much it's kind of entered the culture in ways that we're kind of almost not even aware of. I always say to my students, even if you've never seen this film, you will have heard some of
Yeah.
these lines without, you know, without even knowing where they come from or the references, right? And we see obviously in lots of, you know, subsequent representations, gangsters sort of imitating films like The Godfather or Scarface or whatever, you know. So yeah, there's this kind of circuit of representation and imitation, which seems to implicate film and TV quite heavily. So yeah, I wonder how much ethical responsibility should film and TV representations bear? You know, is this bad? I suppose, should
This
we
is
feel
always
bad about this? You know?
this was always the hardest question I ever got whenever I was giving a talk on my book before it was published. And it's a question I always get
Mm,
from different types of stakeholders. And one thing I just want to say, that when you talked about this myth that's all over the place, one of the things we do in my class is I ask students to send me any mafia mise en abîme. I'm like, it's all over the place. You just haven't noticed it yet. But
yeah.
once you start looking, you're going to find it everywhere. And so now before each class, I have 3 or 4 either clips from a TV show or like commercial or a song. There's a song by, oh shoot, Arctic Monkeys that talks about Mean Streets Be My Baby. I know this song, but I'd never registered it
Really? Oh
until
my
a
God.
student sent
I
it to
didn't
me.
know that.
And so, and that's part of it because it's so, and that was the impetus um, when I first came up with mafia movies. It was 2008. I was watching the Super Bowl. I'm not an American football fan, but I love the commercials. And there was this amazing commercial for it was a spoof of The Godfather, and it was a commercial for Audi, and they did the horse head scene, and I was like, the myth of the mafia is so ingrained in the American imaginary that they don't even think about it as an organization that kills people. It's
Well,
so
or that scene as like a really horrific film, a scene in the film, right? You know, I was rewatching the thing and I'm just like, oh my God, the extent of the blood and the, you know, the way that that's shot, you know, and then as you say, for it to be reworked into a kind of, you know, humorous, we all know this reference kind of thing.
yeah, it's been on like Modern Family and Family Guy and blah 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 over and over again, and that's real horse head, and which always
That was a real horse head.
a real
Oh
horse head.
dear. So
Yeah,
so animals were harmed during
apparently it was taken from like like it was already,
oh, from like an abattoir or something.
yeah, I was already not part of this world. It wasn't killed for the film, but I guess now
Yeah.
you're not allowed to do that anymore. They'd have to use a fake horse head, but it was,
Yeah.
and that adds to it. Like it's
It's so
decapitation,
visceral. Yeah.
blood, and it gets reworked into parody constantly.
Mhm.
And so, and I was really interested in, I was teaching some films well before intro that's Romanzo Criminale year. So you were obsessed with Romanzo Criminale and I hadn't seen it yet, but I was teaching some Italian mafia films and thinking about how the ethical, and this is before like post Romanzo Criminale when they're all beautiful bad guys, you know, with great soundtracks and costumes and stuff, where there was just such a more engaged culture of filmmaking. And so I was in the book, I was really interested in kind of thinking about these two filmic traditions and how they really thought about violence and this question of ethical responsibility. Um, and how much should they bear is interesting, and that was the main kind of one of the main thrusts of sympathetic perpetrators, because the difference between Italian and American, you know, representations of organized crime, with few exceptions, is the Italian ones are based on actual facts, you know, actual criminals, like actual criminal organizations, like actual deaths, actual, you know, scandals and things like that. So, and something you've worked on a lot, and I've taken inspiration from you, is kind of this real huge tension between the popularity of these things and the protests and polemics around them from survivors and victim groups. And so thinking about that, you know, so like the international appeal of something like Subura or Gomorra, the series, they're drawing in tons of fans inside and outside of the country, and they're like sending out this, like what Don Holdaway has written about, that now organized crime is part of, Italian cultural heritage, like, what Alan's talked about with the
tainted
terror.
heritage.
Yeah, and so I'm really kind of stuck with the should, because when I was researching the book, I read as much as I could about, how much do these films and TV series actually influence young people to go kill people and things like that. And the jury's definitely out, and most people say no, they're not actually going to, you might need to be a sociopath to go down that channel, but that most people understand the difference between fiction and fact. But at the same time, as you said, in the Italian tradition, so many real life mobsters go around spouting off, all of these phrases, kind of perpetuating this, what John Foote has called, not John Foote, the other John Dickey, John Dickey, the strange feedback loop between reality and representation and the mythicization that's going on there. So I don't know. What do you think about how much ethical?
I don't know. I go back and forwards over this, because I think on the one hand, I don't necessarily feel that art is there to provide, ideal representations of life or behavior, right? And we have, we can accept the kind of artistic reworking of these things through genre, which goes right back to the start of cinema, right? I mean, organized crime has been in Hollywood since like the 1900s in terms of representations of Italian Americans, right? We think of the 1930s gangster cycle, and there have always been these anxieties as well over, does it influence behavior, or from ethnic groups, does it portray us in a bad light, which is a slightly different question, right?
Yeah.
But one that continues to be sort of very live. And I, sometimes I think, is it just because I enjoy them that I rationalize? Is this my guilty pleasure? Of like, well, I love male melodrama, I love kind of seeing all of this play out. I think, it's sort of helpful, isn't it, when you're trying to get students to really interrogate the films or the series or whatever, rather than have a celebratory kind of approach to it. And, I try and kind of address the myth as much as the kind of what's happening, kind of on screen. So, I think that we have to be sort of very attentive to that on the one hand. And then you also have to kind of recognize the kind of cultural power that these texts have had, so we can't sort of pretend that they don't. Well, we pretend Godfather 3 doesn't exist. We can't. We can't ignore sort of the resonance that these things have had, whilst maybe kind of realizing like that this kind of cultural fixation on, difficult men and anti-heroes, kind of has lots of potentially problematic aspects. Not least because they take up so much space, right? I mean, you've kind of looked at, there are so few films about kind of women's relation to the mafia, right? Because we're not really that interested in women as anti-heroes or, as kind of complex protagonists. That's changing, obviously, gradually. But I think it sort of has suffocated everything else a bit, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think I agree with you. And teaching, last week I taught Goodfellas, and that maybe is even more interesting to teach than The Godfather, because most of the students have seen it. At least my students have seen it, and they come in incredibly strong opinions about Scorsese and love him more than anything in the world.
All of them.
It's just like overwhelming auteur fandom. And
I love him too, but
they forgive him for Mean Streets. They're like, that was just like whatever.
I love Mean Streets.
I love Mean Streets too. But my biggest like success story after teaching that is like when you were saying about this myth that goes back to the beginning of the century, is we watched The Great Train Robbery and talk about how The Great Train Robbery was maybe the first visual text that kind of positions viewers to align themselves with the bad guy, that like creates sympathy for the train for the train robbers rather, and with the gun, with the final gunshots, and then Tommy DeVito like magically appearing at the end and shooting in the camera. It's kind of this idea that the mafia is going to be around as long as there's people like Henry Hill or the viewer, who's going to buy into this idea of like the glamorization of it. And so I'm trying to teach it as like more of a again, like get them to critically think about it. And at the end, they're like, oh yeah, maybe Goodfellas is like much more complicated than I thought.
Well, it's that, I mean, I don't think anyone could ever say that Scorsese isn't totally aware of what he's doing in both ways, right? Of kind of letting us become kind of, sucked into the myth of that while also kind of showing how it works, but also, that showing how seductive it is the way that he does that. And that obviously has that effect. It was really funny just thinking about Goodfellas. Did I send you that when after the attack on the US Capitol, did you see those montages that went around on Twitter when lots of those perpetrators were arrested and people had like set it to the Layla outro?
Oh no!
Oh, I'll send you the link.
Send it to me. I missed it.
It was so good. But yeah, just that's like digression, but kind of thinking
no,
it's the resonance of Goodfellas as well, as a kind of as a text that is still kind of operating, as it were, though in that case, I think we were not supposed to feel sympathetic towards any of these people.
Well, yeah, depends on who your audience is, I guess. I live in the Midwest, so.
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll move on. We're not in the Biden administration, so it's all. It's
all better. All good now.
So, but yeah, that question of sympathy for the devil is one that you've kind of addressed a lot, haven't you? And I guess, one way of doing it is to do what you've done in the Sympathetic Perpetrators book to some extent by looking at kind of audience work, right? And kind of trying to map that rather than just sort of assuming what the effects of a certain text are going to be on the fans, right? And that seems very valuable.
Yeah, that I took a lot of advice from you on how to do that, because it's something it seems incredibly immense and vast, to try to map fan preferences and reaction, and thinking like taking what Murray Smith or Noel Carroll did in their earlier work on, people are responding, like their brains are working in interesting ways, reacting to these various stimuli that are provoking reactions in them. And early on in the project, I really wanted to do that. There's like a summer boot camp at Penn in kind of it's neuroscience for humanities people. So it trains them like to kind of get their heads around neuroscience if you want to do a project about, what happens in people's brains.
Is this like eye tracking and stuff?
Yeah, it's eye tracking, and I think it's Laura Whitman did it for her. She's writing that book on near-death experiences.
Oh my gosh.
And so what happens in people's brain who have a near-death experience and then have mainly a lifelong transformation because of a near-death experience. So it trains you to kind of like think like a neuroscientist in 3 months or whatever. And I didn't do it, and I thought that would take the project in a totally different way. But I did talk with a colleague here, what's his name, Dylan Thomas, I think. And he's a neuroscientist who he puts people in MRIs and has them watch movies and respond to faces. So one of the movies he has them watch is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which I found fascinating because like there's tons of close-ups and it's like, and the soundtrack and all that stuff. And then he tracks happiness levels when they're responding to faces. And so I kind of talked with him about this question of, taking what film studies people or literary studies people did like one step further and really thinking about what happens emotionally with people when they're responding positively or negatively to these sympathetic perpetrators. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to become a neuroscientist. I'm too old for that. And my skill set's limited. I don't have an
hard.
It sounds really hard. No MRI in my bathroom. So I thought the audience studies would be the best thing. And so I wrote that article on Romanzo Criminale, which became a chapter on the book, which was looking at all of these paratexts around Romanzo Criminale and seeing how people responded to them when they were more or less closer, when they're more or less close to the film and to the series, and how mediation made fans either react negatively, positively, or a combination of both to remediated images of the Banda della Moggiana, both from the film and the actual people. And it was super interesting because the more mediated they were, the more distanced they were. People were like, I hate them. But the more like kind of interplay there was between fact and fiction, so many of the fans, and there was like, some of them had like 100, 200, 600,000, likes and comments. And so you just like get what you could. And many of them were taken down because of copyright. So yeah, that was a super bummer. But you saw this really conflictual, to your question, really like, I love these people, but let's hang them up the wall. Like things like that. These guys are the most wonderful people ever, but they should be shot dead. And they were really strong reactions. And I'm not really answering your question, but it's something that I found fascinating, that buying in for sympathy for the devil makes, I think, people have really, contradictory reactions. It's much easier, I think, for someone like me, I'm obsessed with like Ciro Di Marzio and Gomorrah. He's my end all be all. And I think the way that he's constructed throughout, however long he's there, could be the whole time, forever, whatever. The way that he's constructed makes people who might want to feel sympathy for the devil for him. It works perfectly to forgive him for the most heinous crimes. And I find that I struggle with that myself when I'm watching someone do something horrible, and then all of a sudden I'm crying for them for having done something horrible. And so that it's like, what does that mean? What does that say about me? Like, and for obviously the millions of fans who I think also feel maybe less strongly than me, or maybe stronger than me, this kind of, that rooting for the bad guy while they're doing something bad, and then they feel bad about themselves doing something badly.
Yeah, and it's often a kind of, I think performance comes into this a lot as well, doesn't it? Because often it can be that level of performance that humanizes or, succeeds in making the audience kind of either root for the character or have that feeling of, but he's so complex, or he's so tortured. We can think of James Gandolfini in The Sopranos, right? Which is such a great example of how somebody took that character, which was written as complex and tortured, but kind of through the performance just gave that even more, everything, pathos, comedy, drama, melodrama, right?
Yep. Yeah, he's kind of like one of the templates for how, complex masculinities now have gone viral. I remember that, and I talked about it in my book, but when David Chase cast him, Gandolfini like almost didn't show up to the casting call because he was so anxious and he hated going to casting calls and all of this. He's like, it just changed the face of television. And Gandolfini said, I didn't ever think he'd cast me. I thought he'd cast like, not George Clooney, but like an Italian George Clooney. It would be like Pier Francesco Savino or something. I don't know who.
Yeah. A kind of Al Pacino type, right? But yeah, no, the kind of the sort of complex middle-aged male hero sort of became, because then Breaking Bad comes after that, and all sorts of other, we can think of the book Difficult Men, which excavates all of this very well, doesn't it? I want to just ask you something quickly about female characters, because in Unfinished Business, you talk really interestingly about, we know that in many of these narratives, The Godfather is a great example, that women are very marginalized. But if we look at Italian films particularly, you argue that the Italian sort of trauma that the mafia represents, and that's a kind of unresolved trauma because it's still going on, right? It's not fixed. It can't be, the state can't seem to do anything about it, right? And that you argue that this unresolved grief of the Italian nation is sort of displaced onto women and then female characters in these films who are kind of debased. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I struggled with this. So I was writing this book. I had a few assumptions going into it. One, clearly that as you said very eloquently, so I will only repeat that the kind of grief around the trauma, that the trauma around the mafia is unfinished. And so in that it's unfinished, how can one more and move beyond, kind of, have all of the steps that are necessary after a cultural trauma has been like kind of understood as such. And then I also saw that basically from 2000 to when I wrote the book, I think the last film I treat was Cesare deve morire. Was that 2013, 2012?
12, maybe.
That two things were happening. Like, men are celebrated, like Le Conseguenze dell'amore, and all of the women are raped, killed off, debased, have no narrative closure. And it was really hard, and I wasn't trying to just pick films that did that. It was really, really hard. I was looking for films that provided a counterexample, and I really couldn't find any. And I probably missed some, but I did look very hard. And so it really seemed to me that that what we've talked about before, being a man in the mafia, is something that it's okay to celebrate, to narrativize, to, the end of these films, like, what's it called? Fine pena mai, paradiso perduto. He's like a prison narrative, but he's totally celebrated at the end of it. Like, there's this beautiful image of like an island and a lighthouse and the forever after in love and things like that. But so many, the rape, inventing narratives about women just to kill them off. That happens in Clash of Risotto with Leah. That rape is totally invented. And the story in Una Siciliana Ribelle, so many of the facts around her death are invented. She didn't have a boyfriend. It makes it seem like she's killing herself for the boyfriend, and definitely for the loss of the father figure and the judge, when like so much is unknown about that suicide. I've been thinking, with your question, I was thinking like what's happening more recently in Italian films, and I think some things haven't really changed, like with that anime nere, and the piranhas and things like that. Like those more kind of narrative, more mainstream films, you still see kind of the same power dynamics in play. And anime nere is like horrible because you have this blind woman who falls in love with her attacker essentially, and then has this incredibly like dependent relationship upon him, and then I won't say what happens, spoiler.
I've seen that film and I cannot remember anything about it.
It's like they're always like in a dark apartment.
Okay.
And she like falls in love with him because he kidnaps her, and like in record time she falls in love with him, this blind woman.
Okay, so that's trauma sort of displaced onto her as a kind of victim.
And then in the end, he is killed in the rescue operation. He's killed, and it's all about grieving for him, and not, this trauma that she went through and all of this. I mean, and a difference, I guess, would be with Gomorrah, the series, with the more powerful women in the film, but they don't meet good ends. So, and some of them I feel less excited about some of the women who appear in the later episodes, but Donna Ima or Chanel, they're really powerful women and take kind of these really strong leadership positions, and their narratives seem to be going in this really interesting new direction. In many ways they're sexualized, they have fabulous clothes, they have, similar to a lot of their male counterparts, really interesting storylines and arcs, great performance, as you were saying, but then their narratives end in these ways that are so traditional in terms of the old guard, so there seems to be a little bit more power given to them, but they can't get out of that trap.
And there's a sort of reluctance, isn't there, to kind of to move beyond these kind of very traditional structures. And it's hard to know where that comes, what's motivating that.
Yeah, because you talk about in Romanzo Criminale, the series, how, it takes place in the 70s, but I think you said it totally elides feminism.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's a kind of, well, I read it as a kind of nostalgic, kind of, wasn't it great, before we had to deal with, which is also one of the ways that The Godfather gets read as well, isn't it? That kind of, this is a film that comes out at the height of everything, Vietnam, civil rights movement, women's liberation, gay rights, and yet is so powerfully kind of nostalgic for a certain type of masculinity, right? And is also kind of retro, sort of being set in the 40s. And I think that's, a kind of interesting way to read a film like The Godfather. And that maybe was kind of influencing me when I was reading Romanzo Criminale.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And then, so there's other types of series, at least, that have come out recently that have received international kind of appeal, and they feature women, but they're not at all gangster films. So, so you have My Brilliant Friend, and then you have We Are Who We Are, and then you have even that Luna Nera, the witch film that's on Netflix right now. They all feature like really strong female characters in a certain way. So you see definitely an evolution there. But I can't really think of, I mean, in Subura, the women.
Yeah, it's very tokenistic, isn't it? That last season, the girlfriend, and the wife of Spadina, there's a kind of attempt to give them this, but yeah, we won't spoil the ending of that. But
Yeah.
it kind of doesn't go very well.
No, and I can't really think of, I mean, other, and I haven't, I mean, even that Trader, the Buscetta, the film about
Bellocchio.
Yeah, that doesn't provide us with many good examples. It's just like conflicted masculinity. I mean, he's much less likable than some of the others, but I think he has flash, I mean, he definitely has some charm. And
well, they knew what they were doing in casting Favino there,
yes.
right? There was a certain something that was being looked for, But yeah, and it's funny because when we think about it as well, I mean, just to go back to Scorsese for a minute, I mean, there was a kind of kerfuffle over The Irishman, wasn't there? Because there were so few female characters in it, full stop, right? And the daughter, the Anna Paquin character, who gets like one line, right? And there was I saw a lot of outrage on Twitter about this, kind of after the film and stuff. And, the Scorsese defenders, of course, will kind of say, well, this is what he's illustrating, the kind of, the marginalization of women, but you can also argue
that he's perpetuating the marginalization of women.
Well, and that kind of, the genre is not going to, it's not going to change until it kind of,
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, he makes broad statements about Marvel comics and how they're ruining like the world as we know it now, but isn't very self-aware when it comes to his power position and making a few subtle changes to
Yeah. I mean, I love him, so I find it difficult to critique, but I totally agree. And I think that we saw, for example, with The Sopranos, how interesting it can be to even, to make that marginalization of women a kind of theme in itself, right? Women on the edge, Carmela, Adriana, getting sucked into, and giving them that space. Okay, you don't have to pretend that there's a kind of, that there's always like a kind of post-feminist agency there, when there isn't, because you're still dealing with like kind of oppressive structures or whatever, right? But you can explore those limitations, right?
No, I think Sopranos really, really gets at that with these really powerful figures who are, haunting Tony, and they're explored in a much more, I think, interesting and subtle way than definitely what happens in The Godfather. One thing I found funny in teaching The Godfather, there's a 10-minute clip in the sequence in The Godfather where all the women are together, like they're all there in these 10 minutes. And it's when Michael gets married to Apollonia. So it's kind of going back and forth, Sicily and New York. So like he's getting married to Apollonia. So she's like one kind of woman, and it's the courtship of being married. It's Connie being brutally beaten by her husband. It's Mama Corleone answering the phone, holding a baby. And then Kay wearing red to go question Tom Hagen, where's Michael?
Yeah.
And Sonny sleeping with his mistress, as they call her, upstairs. And that's the only moment when like all of the women are together, and it's kind of this like token, here's all the women, and like let's just see what they're doing, and then now let's move on to other stuff.
Well, let's get back to the real business of this.
Yeah, let's get Michael home.
Yeah, and that, well, of course, and Michael's wife, the Apollonia character is, I find kind of a hilarious sort of figure in a way.
Monday, Tuesday, Friday, Wednesday.
Yeah, the silent 16-year-old or whatever she's supposed to be, right, who then gets blown up like kind of 5 minutes, just to provide just enough kind of grief, for him to kind of move on to the next stage of his, of his criminal career,
He's consolidated his Sicilianness. He's like now can be the Godfather because he had to go to Sicily. He had to have, he had to touch the soil, and now he can go home and
marry a wasp and carry on with everything.
Who likes abandons all those children at the bus. When he goes to see her, she's with all these children, and then she just walks off. What's happened to the children?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah. Well, there's probably a commentary there, isn't there? On kind of her willingness to abandon her, her principles for the kind of seductive mafia lifestyle. You can probably read it. Yeah, and there's a kind of, I find Kay in some ways such a sort of annoying character, but I know that's, that's part of, in some ways, part of what the film's kind of doing. In other ways, it's just because the film doesn't give her anything other than, this nagging kind of outsider status, and it does. Is it a missed opportunity, or is that the way it's kind of has to be?
Yeah, that Dan, our own Dan Paul, wrote a little thing about that scene, the closing the door scene that you talk about in Angela chapter.
I've got to look at that.
Yeah, she's like framed in the doorway, so she's central, but she's excluded, and just the way that where the camera is placed and looking at her, and it kind of foregrounds her entrapment, but she's also incredibly central in breaking the fourth wall by looking out. And then it ends, and of course we have a totally different Kay in The Godfather Part 2 for all sorts of reasons. But so yeah, it's just, I think oh my God, I have to send you this thing. My student sent me this, I've never heard of this show called the Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
The cop show. Yeah, I've watched it.
They're trying to find the killer or whoever, somebody, and they're doing it by calling it the Diane Keaton movie. Like, so it's perfect. And so when I teach Goodfellas, I show the clip and talk about how Karen has this, agency and voice and stuff. And we show that it's this great clip where they're trying to educate the police commissioner on, what's happening. And he's like, we have to think like The Godfather. And the guy's like, do you mean the Diane Keaton movie? He's like, no. And he's like, Fredo, oh, that's Diane Keaton's brother-in-law. Michael, no, that's Diane Keaton's husband. And so they strategize the whole thing. And I find it so hysterical from the perspective of gender and rewriting Diane Keaton into centrality.
Imagine, rewriting her as the protagonist of that film.
Yeah. So I thought that was really.
She does have one. I don't want to diss her because, as I say, that, the film doesn't give her much to work with, but I think it's Godfather 2 where she has like one of the worst line readings ever, in that moment where she shouts at Michael and she says, I had an abortion, Michael. And this, like, just the line reading is so terrible.
I know. An abortion. I had a son, your son, and I had him killed because
you can just act it up.
Oh, and the Sicilian thing that's been going on for 2000. Sorry.
Well, we could see you've just memorized the whole.
Well, I use it as a teaching point, and I test my students. I'm like, you've learned a lot about the mafia. What is Diane Keaton, or what is Kay saying that's incorrect? And they're like, the mafia is not 2,000 years old. Good, you got it.
Oh my God! So your students are so well trained at this point.
Well, it's easy because, you know, the year that Ohio State was founded as a university is 1870. So it's a
Italian
really
tradition.
easy thing to teach them the first day of class. Like the mafia is, Cosa Nostra is as old as Ohio State. And they're like, oh, like that's not a right answer
There
on the
is
quiz.
no other similarity.
Yeah.
We must emphasize
Yes.
there's no other relationship. Oh, that's funny. Oh, well, I guess I should let you go because I know you have many other things to be doing with your time.
Oh no, this is super fun. If you have, I have until 1:30. I have to hop on another meeting in 8 minutes. So
okay. Well, I mean, we've talked about masculinity, obviously endlessly. We've talked about trauma. We've talked about masculinity in crisis. We've talked about sympathetic perpetrators, the kind of myth of the mafia. Is there anything else? Yeah, I guess maybe just to finish on, I mean, because your book, the Mafia Movies book, was, you know, as I said, was so foundational because it's the first thing that kind of brings together, right, two different traditions of filmmaking, right? So many people are familiar with the Italian American stuff, right? And obviously very few outside of Italy or outside of Italian film studies or know a lot of these Italian movies, which haven't really made it big, right, in any sort of particular way. So I guess, is there a sense in which we know that the Italian American tradition is so powerful, the kind of myth of the mafia sort of comes primarily from there. And we see in films like Gomorrah, for example, how even in that sort of degraded reality, they're sort of taking inspiration from like Scarface or The Godfather or kind of whatever. Is there a sense now in which kind of Italian filmmaking about the mafia has kind of taken on its own sort of myth-making function or effect, would you say?
I think so. And I think I thought about, you know, what happened particularly in television, you know, with Romanzo Criminale. And of course, you have like new networks and new financing models and all this stuff, new production models and new distribution models. But with Romanzo Criminale, the film in 2005, I think you kind of see a break from the past where we had like engaged cinema, and then you have all these biopics, like 8 million biopics about the fallen anti-mafia martyrs, and a lot of kind of the cinema d'impegno, and it's vague and things like that. But I think from 2005 on, it seems like the Italian brand is definitely one of the myth making process. At the same time, there's also all of these other kinds of more minor productions, mainly documentaries and things like the Mafia Only Kills in Summer, you know, something like that's definitely much more internationally popular. But and you can actually watch the series. I found it here on MHZ Choice. I didn't know it.
Oh, I haven't seen it. Okay.
It's like all about the good guys. No, but
never as interesting.
Never as interesting. So yeah, I think I mean, I think so. It seems to be, you know, like our friends like Luca Barra and Massimo Scaglione would say that, you know, Gomorrah just totally ripped off The Sopranos and ripped off Breaking Bad and ripped off like those models, and then like Subura ripped off Gomorrah and is derivative to it. But it does seem to have its own, I guess, brand, as it were, which a lot of it does have to do with that factual based. It's like, you know, people like
yeah, so it's interesting that kind of Gomorrah, the book and the film are sort of at the heart of that, aren't they? You know, because I'm guessing that maybe without the success of the film of Gomorrah, you know, the series perhaps wouldn't have come into being, right? But then they diverge so much in terms of style, in terms of technique, in terms of the kind of glamorization in different ways. And it's interesting because, you know, I'm teaching Gomorrah at the moment on a course which has students who don't study Italian, you know, so are not familiar particularly with the Camorra or traditions of Italian filmmaking or anything like that. So it's interesting to see how they respond to this kind of positioning of Italy through the kind of realist techniques of Gomorrah as a kind of, you know, sort of quite debased debased masculinity. You know, we talk a lot of grotesque masculinities in that film.
Yeah.
But yet in itself, the film, maybe just through its success or maybe just through that endless power of the mafia kind of outside of the nation, you know, gave rise to so much else.
Yeah, and it's interesting to what role Saviano did or didn't have in that, you know. You know, and I know that who was it wrote that really interesting article. He was a PhD student in Michigan, on Saviano's role, like problematic role in the Gomorrah brand, you know, being both against the mafia, but promoting Gomorrah, the series, and saying the series was really anti-crime and anti-glamour, which it's totally not.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. So I think that that's really interesting too. So his kind of, his status, you know, is this kind of really outspoken mafia figure, in promoting a series, which apparently he says doesn't glamorize organized crime, adds another layer to it. But
yeah, and it's interesting that even someone like him is kind of, I guess we can see him as sort of wrestling in some ways with these questions, right? Of like, yeah, what's it like to kind of make your career out of, you know, this connection to, you know, to crime in that way.
No, it's that's, and you know, and another thing I wanted to say about just really interestingly about what's going on in the mafia now is there's that massive Ndrangheta maxi trial going on right now.
Oh yeah.
It's like 342, or I can't remember how many accusees, and that got massive media attention for like one day. And it was, you know, in the Times, and it was in the Guardian, and it was, you know, all over the place. And then and it's just kind of, and now even in Italy, like people aren't talking about it anymore. It was like, oh, massive, you know, oh, it's the Renga, we're finally gonna, you know, bring these people to justice. And I was trying to, like, I wanted to show my students an update a week or so ago, and I'm like, wait, they're not even talking about it in the Repubblica anymore. It's like missing from discourse. And so like that's that, for whatever reason, it was like hot and popular to talk about. But and maybe it's back on, I haven't looked for a week, but
yeah,
that similar pattern of public eye for a moment and then kind of gone.
Yeah, even though the kind of ramifications are huge, and you know, these are things that are kind of rumbling on and on, aren't they, you know? But yeah, it kind of says something about, as you say, the, you know, the sort of endless appetite for kind of narrativizations of this, but maybe less of an appetite for just, you know, kind of absorbing the facts, or, you know, tuning in into, you know, the kind of reality of it, you know, maybe just because the reality is more mundane on many levels, and kind of more complicated and more boring, and, you know. Okay, well, I'm going to let you go, but I really want to thank you so much for giving your time so generously. And yeah, and thank you for the works that you've published, which my students are using and enjoying, I think, and kind of making good use of. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to let them, and also students, if you have any questions about anything, send me an email, and Catherine can provide that for you. I'd be happy to chat further, or, you know, recommend any sort of readings or anything like that. So
well, you might regret that, but
anything, as I was saying, to not talk about like budget and the pandemic. So yes.
Yeah, this is our escape, isn't it? Talking about, you know, kind of complicated men that, you know, we secretly love. Okay, I'm gonna let you go, but thanks so much, and talk soon.
Talking to you. Talk soon.
Bye.
Bye.